Welcome back, everyone. Once again, I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation. My guest today is Devin Scott. Devin is a holistic and somatic practitioner that is very dedicated to helping one get in touch with what's happening. I love that, and we're going to talk more about that. Welcome to the Element Q podcast. I'm your host, TJ Woodward, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for this empowering journey. Each week, we shine a light on the authors, thought leaders, therapists, coaches, and healers of all types who are making a difference in the LGBTQ plus community. Together, we honor those who came before us, the courageous and resilient trailblazers who stood for our rights and recognition. Their strength laid the foundation we stand on today. Here, we celebrate their legacy by diving into the stories, insights, and tools that inspire gentleness, healing, and transformation. So get ready to be uplifted and empowered. This is the Element Q podcast. Devin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, TJ.
I'm so grateful. And I know that there's a lot going on in your personal life, which I'm knowing will inform the conversation. And I think there's nothing more authentic than being authentic with what's happening in our lives. And when we were talking about what might be a great starting point for our conversation, we were talking about secrecy and shame and how we can actually bring that shame into the light so that we can have a transformational experience. So I'm wondering how you want to get that conversation started. I know there's a lot happening in your personal life, which will inform the conversation for sure.
Uh, yeah, so as we talked about, I'm in the midst of a very painful breakup that has really had me reflecting on intuition, body wisdom, shame, and secrecy.
Hmm.
Um, I'm a gay man. 2 weeks ago, I found out that my partner was in a fairly predatory secret dom dynamic. Um, and I extricated myself because I sensed that there was a real sadistic bent to the commands that were coming my way.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm still a lot in the unknown about figuring this out. And in the process afterwards, I have an enormous amount of grief. I have fear around all the unknown, what I was staying with for months. And I have a real wish for this other dynamic to be over because I've seen the damage that came out of it. And as we were talking about, it's something that I think really can only happen in the dark. It can only happen when we allow the combination of shame and secrecy to fester.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we have this conversation honestly. And why not just dive right in? But when we look at shame and we look at the secrecy that is often what helps feed the shame or grow the shame, we naturally also look at what you pointed to, which is the shadow and the darkness. And I think there's sometimes a very nuanced conversation to have because it's not a one size fits all, right? There are many things that people engage in that might be something that maybe is erotic to them, or maybe it's something that they enjoy, whether that be sexually or romantically, that we want to be sure to say, hey, we all have a different point of view of that. And I think within the LGBTQ plus community, we're kind of on the forefront. It's like maybe we were assigned that in some way on the forefront of like, kind of shifting some of the paradigm around the shame around sex and sexuality. And yet, and what I'm hearing you saying is sometimes also some of this is coming from a place deep within us that might be shameful, right? That has shame and that's living in the shadow. One, how do we navigate it? And I'm just curious for you, how are you working through this personally? And of course, how does it connect with your work?
Um, I feel like there's a lot of questions, so I'll
Yes.
probably not answer all of them there. Um, Maybe I'll start by just talking about how I conceptualize shame.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think of shame as an enemy until we make it an enemy. I think of shame as kind of this profound tendency towards pro-social behavior. If we think about the populations that don't have shame, like pathological narcissism or sociopathy, we see what happens when shame is not present at all. We get really antisocial behavior, we get really harmful behavior. So shame has this really powerful voice in our head saying what might lead to social rejection. And if we see it for the pro-social bent it is, if we allow it to be social wisdom, it can be really helpful and healing. I think the problem is when we don't befriend it, when we let it sit, when we let it tell us that who we are is unlovable or unlikable, then we start to hide ourselves in darkness. And whatever is in the darkness, if we play in the shadows and it's not in an integrated way, there's always a cost.
Yeah. So how do we work with shame? And first of all, I wanted to say thank you for that because I think sometimes we tend to look at certain aspects of ourselves as good or bad or right or wrong. And of course, when we're in the shame of the shame, that just creates more of that, right? I kind of think of shame. I'm a visual person, so I think about swimming in oatmeal. Like there's this thing that's happening, and I'm trying to move through it, but everything is like difficult or in slow motion. And I like that you articulated that shame is something that, back in the day, and you're way younger than I am, but back in the day, John Bradshaw in his book Healing the Shame That Binds You, back in the 80s, was the first time I was reading about shame. And he talked about healthy and unhealthy shame, which, has been reframed a little bit now. I don't even love to think of things as healthy or unhealthy for so many reasons, but like useful, not so useful, right? And when I reject this idea that I feel broken or damaged, which in my own story, it's such a huge part of my story. I, at a very early age, decided I was unlovable, decided I was unworthy, and that shame ran my life. And one of the ways I managed it is to show no one, to try to pretend or to use a strategy of looking good, of having it all together. And so I was separating more and more and more from myself. And through a long series of events, addiction, recovery, therapy, spiritual community, I came to understand that it's truly about integrating, having compassion for all parts, especially that younger self. I think about my 7-year-old, who was this little gay boy in Indiana in the 1970s that certainly was not celebrated as this effervescent little being that I was. And bottom line is shame doesn't heal shame, right? And I was applying shame to my shame. And honestly, I was finding external support groups and therapeutic models that kind of supported shame, trying to heal shame. Curious your thoughts about that.
Oh, 100%. But I'm going to answer and also thank you for sharing that. I also am someone who comes from my own personal deep background of shame, and my version of it was always extreme codependence or co-narcissism, which is I will have value finally if I can fix you, if I can help you, if I can serve you. And looking at this breakup, my surrendering of saving caused a collapse of my own shame.
Mm.
Um, oh my gosh, I forgot your question.
Well, it doesn't even matter because I like where you're headed with this. So I'm curious. I love what you're talking about because when I think about, core false beliefs, false identities that we take on, or we could call that shame, we end up having a strategy to manage it. And I like that you're pointing to because my goodness, did I have that for many, many years. Let me save you because I was afraid to look at my own wounds that really were wanting attention, but I had abandoned at a very early age. And so this idea of like, let me save you became like a 20-year journey of trying to heal that externally.
Honestly, it was when I thought I had broken out of finally, and now I am seeing that this might just be a lifetime journey of finding our own needs, finding what we want, what feels right for us. But I think incrementally it feels a little easier. Like the parts of myself that feel integrated when shame comes around them, I think that version of shame on the parts that I've grown to love feels welcome because it does tell me when it might be unsafe in that social space. And truthfully, I don't want to be unsafe in a social space, even if I love the version of myself that would be rejected. It's the parts that I maybe haven't come to terms with where shame feels a little more unmanageable, and I've hit one of them.
Yeah. And how to navigate that because in the midst of it is very different than looking back at it. In retrospect, I can look at some of the times that were the most painful and say, wow, they were so transformational because I got to see myself at a deeper level. And it's such a nuanced conversation because the last thing I would ever want to say to someone is like, look for the great gift in this, or, look for the transformation, right? To honor. And I already feel that from you very deeply, Devin, that you're someone who honors where you're at in the moment, right? And I think there's no greater gift to offer our friends, our loved ones, our clients than to simply be present with what is and see what's there. So it's like this very interesting balance of, wow, I'm in this pain. Can I honor it? And at the same time, transformation for myself has come in some of those darkest moments.
I think in this process, I've been trying to hold space for what I think of as dual consciousness. Maybe like the two truths in Buddhism, where like I'm having this horrendous embodied experience. Like I was in a cab with my friend on Saturday and I was like whole body ugly heaving, sobbing in the back of a lift for 30 minutes. And I was like, well, I wonder if they review me or not. Um, and at the same time, I'm having this second layer of consciousness, which is more spiritual, which is what karmic cycle am I breaking? What timeline is shifting? What is the meaning of this experience? And I'm trying to hold them both without using one to excuse the other. Because I'm also seeing this being a profound moment of taking my power, of breaking inherited trauma scripts. And also, it just sucks.
Yeah. And I love what you're articulating because we hold both of those truths and value. To me, it's honoring both of those, right? The part of me who understands what you said so beautifully, which is I might be working with generations of trauma. I came from my family has a lot of sexual trauma on both sides. My dad and his brothers. Um, we're just going to say they're on one side of that equation. I'm going to leave it at that for now. I've healed so much with my dad, and I don't want to say anything disparaging about him for sure. My mom on her side, all she had four sisters, all had sexual trauma. So they had come together, and my dad and his brothers were sexually traumatized by their female babysitter at a very young age, which is very uncommon actually. And there's a lot of distortion around that. And there are times that I am aware that even becoming a sexual being was terrifying for me. When I was in my teenage years, first of all, like the societal norm in Indiana in the 1970s was it wasn't really okay to be gay. That's one piece. But the other piece was just like this becoming a sexual being and how I wanted to push that down. And, there are large segments of society that support that. So there's these moments where, I mean, I remember being in this relationship where I was deeply in love with this person who could not possibly be more unavailable to me. We're friends today, but like this person could not have been more unavailable. And I was pining and yearning and literally driving around at night, looking for where he might be because he was using heroin. I mean, it was like a after school special kind of drama. And and I was well into my recovery, by the way, but there was a place where like you said, I just found myself in the fetal position sobbing. And it did feel like there were like these generations of trauma being brought up to the surface. Did not make it pleasant. I will say that.
But necessary, right?
Yeah.
Release.
Yeah.
I also come from a family with sexual violence, and I think part of what was happening in my relationship was this kind of dueling. Uh, Relationships are always mirrors, right? We always attract energetically the journey we're meant to be going on. But I saw such profound shame around his sexuality. And from my family with sexual violence, I have a really high degree of fear around secrecy. For my family's secrets meant murder. My family's secrets were just dangerous. And so my whole body starts to shut down in secrecy. And this is how we were mirroring each other as his shame was collapsing and going deeper. My secrecy fire alarm was going larger and larger. And yeah, we're always replicating these things with each other.
And let's if you're willing to dive into that, not necessarily the specifics, but when one finds themselves, like it sounds like you and I have, replicating something from the past that might not even be ours at all, right? Like this generational trauma that goes back that we might not even consciously know about. I mean, I remember when I was in the first probably decade of my recovery. I would find myself having a body reaction to hypersexuality. I moved to San Francisco in 1991 and lots of exposure to a lot of sexuality, right? And realized that there was so much within me that I would say things like, it's really interesting. I have no memory of specific sexual trauma, but my body has it. Like I remember pressure on my shoulder. I remember hyperventilating, needing to leave certain situations. And obviously very painful to go through that, I had come out of that super rescuing kind of relationship and I had dedicated myself to not doing that anymore. And it was like removing that piece of it allowed me to kind of start to move into being more aware of my body, right? Because I wasn't trying to escape that pain. I was wanting to be present with it. And so I remember thinking, if I can just remember exactly what happened, I can be free, which absolutely is not my experience. But when I can become aware of what's happening in my body and honor that, and that was a multi-year process, Devin. It wasn't like, oh, I get this now. Something's in my body that's informing me a place that's wanting to heal or to transform. That's not where I was at with it. I was just in a lot of pain.
This has been a very deep experience for me present right now is that I will never know all of my answers. I won't know every command. I won't know this. I don't know everything I just went through. But my body was screaming the whole time, you are not safe here.
Yeah,
And I was unwilling to let that be enough. I spiraled. I desperately looked to find the facts to justify it. And I think it's very colonial. It's very
yeah,
Western that actually my rational brain has to be the one guiding the decision when my somatic side is screaming, leave,
yeah.
screaming like you are not safe here. And I couldn't honor that. This is the space I work in. And instead of doing what I would tell a client, which is like, oh, let's assume this is body wisdom. I gaslit it. I was being gaslit, and then I gaslit myself, and I sat in it. I think you had said something about like how do we break out of it, and you had talked about finding integrity, and I think that is always the answer because no matter how hard these things get, I think we always have a voice telling us what our integrity
That's right.
is in that moment, and that is the one that is not ruminating. It is not compulsive. It is not fiery. It is not passionate. It is just the one that sits there sturdily, being like, I think you should leave here. Or
Yeah.
like this is not right. And often it's really hard to follow, but that's the one that breaks the cycles, that allows that whole body convulsion, that lets it out.
Wow. And you're pointing to something that I'm passionate about, and I believe you are too. When we're only in the mind, which again, you named it kind of the Western model, whether that be the medical model, the behavioral health model, which is like, to put it in layperson's terms, let's figure this out, right? Let's figure this out. But also, along with that is pathologizing, right? Using certain criteria to try to figure something out or name something, whether we call it a disorder or whether we call it these different diagnoses. And I think it's so limiting, right? Because if we don't include the somatic piece, and for anyone watching or listening who doesn't know, simply said, it's as you said, Devin, so beautifully, the wisdom of the body. Um, you know, the body does keep the score, as a popular book tells us, right? And that is information for us that is different than the mind because I was trying to figure it all out. And I discovered for myself that the mind, being very powerful, was also trying to prevent me from having these deep feelings or this experience. And it's in that experience that transformation can often happen.
I think that's where individuality really breaks free. I sometimes find myself wondering why we have emotions, like evolutionarily, because theoretically our brains could have just bypassed it. And I think one of the reasons is emotions allow rich personal experiences while maintaining privacy. Theoretically, our brains could have evolved to not have to have this weird intermediary in our social lives. We could have just had ESPN or something like that. These are all electric signals. There could have been a way. But the emotions are here so that we all are having a shared but individual experience. And that is so deep, and rich. Sorry, I'm not even sure that was responsive.
I love what you're saying because in my own journey, running from the emotions was such an unconscious strategy. And you named on a couple of occasions, I think the most important part, and that is, well, an important part, and that is safety. Right. So of course it's do I trust my intuition and my inner knowing enough to know if this relationship is safe? And then we get to go deeper with that and how to create internal safety. And internal safety is something that has taken me many, many years because I abandoned myself at such an early age. And I have compassion for the reason I abandoned myself. It genuinely and literally wasn't safe for me to feel what I was feeling. So, like, let me have compassion and at the same time, then realize that's my automatic response. I'm responding by trying to not feel. And for me, that was substances and that was sex and that was shopping. And I mean, I can name all the different things that I was using to escape. And in some ways, recovery or wellness journey or transformation is simply about being present with what is without going into the story.
Without needing it to change or without having a linear path. I remembered earlier you had asked if the model of healing uh, reinforces shame, and I think it does because the idea that we have a linear path towards growth, I think, is very Western. It puts us on the path of we're not okay as we are immediately as a foundation for our transformation, which I think itself is shame-inducing. I'm like you, I am anti-pathology. I trained in psychotherapy and then I left to work non-clinically, and I tend to think of the DSM as just a cataloging of people's responses to capitalism that seem inconvenient to capitalism. I think one of the things is I think people are having adaptive, normative responses to shitty environments, but I think we also treat things as individual when they're social, and I think some of these things are adaptive in communities. Like at an individual level, depression looks like one thing, but at a societal level, depression kind of also looks like a punk protest. Like these are people who be like, I'm just tapping out. The stuff you're handing me, I'm not willing to participate in. And when enough people do that in society and we start to listen, we start to see that our systems are broken. And PTSD is similar. At an individual level, it looks like one thing, but when we see people having PTSD symptoms in our society, it says to us there's something frayed in the fabric of society that is damaging people, and we need to be looking at these symptoms because they're a social alarm that something is wrong.
Yeah, something needs attention. And that deeper attention, I love what you're saying because a response, and I remember again in my own journey being just this effervescent little loving kid, right, that was very open and very deeply feeling. And then, watching war on TV and hearing the way men talked about women, the tall people in my life who were men talking about women, in an objectifying way and all the different layers, right? My grandfather, who I loved very much, overt racism, right? So all the different things that were happening that caused this deep level of confusion, but also kind of like, I mean, to put it bluntly, shell shock, like I shut down. And so I love what you're saying. I mean, I don't love that it's the nature of a shared experience for so many of us, but I love that you're pointing to it with the wisdom of there's something here that's greater than just us individually that's wanting attention. And the DSM, for anyone who doesn't know, it's sort of the way therapists diagnose someone, and the intention of it. I want to be clear, the intention of it is to help them. What I see often happening, though, is it ends up compartmentalizing and labeling them, and then we end up looking at someone as that's who they are instead of there's this cluster of symptoms. I wonder what's wanting to be revealed, and that's the individual journey. And then I love that you're pulling out and saying, yeah, and let's look as a society. In my first book, I actually diagnosed America, the United States of America. I'm not going to say what diagnosis I gave it, but I'm sure you can figure them out. It's like I can think of at least two diagnoses the United States of America could have that in an individual would be considered insane, but somehow collectively we're like, this is normal.
A few.
You thought of a couple. So,
Yeah.
one of the things that I'm curious about for you is in your work, how does the wisdom of the body, and of course, obviously, what's present for you and in your own journey, how does the wisdom of the body help one transform that's beyond just the construct in our mind or the labels we might have, or again, this idea of like sort of shame-based healing shame? What's different about the wisdom of the body?
I am one of those people who just fundamentally thinks we never truly change unless we don't want to change. And that whenever you just watch something unfold and embrace it with love, it unfolds. And so maybe I don't have the answer. Maybe I just think it's a little bit of magic that when you let the body start to speak for itself, start to move itself, start to say what it wants, start to speak in harmony, I just see beautiful things unfold.
Let's talk a little bit more about that change. I want to get clarity because I think there's something really powerful in what you're saying. Say a little bit more about the idea of like how we create true change, from the inside out or from this body wisdom.
So I think part of the reason I left psychotherapy is it just always felt like we were assigning an external goal. Society kind of wants us to move along this metric. How do we do this? This is socially normative. This breath work will help you. Whereas I think when we start with the body, the goal comes from our spirit. Whatever layer of consciousness that is, somatic tracking, you're always looking at all the different layers of consciousness. But I mean, I'm a very spiritual person. I think the goal is inside of us already. It's not handed to us. And so when we listen deeply enough, we just start to discover the way it moves on its own. Um, and we get like a profound respect for it in the process. Uh, but it also just requires a surrender because the minute our ego takes control of whatever that goal is, it doesn't let it just unfold. It puts control parameters around it, puts anxiety around it, it removes the presence. And even transformation, sometimes I'm like, transformation I think of as happens whether or not we want it to. But if we let it happen being witnessed and being loved and being in presence, it happens more beautifully.
Well, and I think you're pointing to something that I want to kind of talk a little bit more about, and that is the role of the practitioner in that model, which I am wholeheartedly in alignment with, by the way. Um, to be truly present with a person to assist them in becoming clearer for themselves of what their body is wanting to reveal, not from a place of like, I love that you said that. Yeah, it's like, because in the treatment industry now, it's like holistic healing is on everyone's business card. And then if we ask them what it is, it's breath work, which I love, by the way. It's equine therapy, which I love, but it's put on that business card because this will help someone fix them, right? And like that's not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about a level of awareness as both the practitioner, which creates the space for a person to be able to access that for themselves. And I think the greatest gift I've ever been offered is the presence. And in my work in conscious recovery, I talk about how we're viewing the client. Am I viewing them as damaged or broken or a project? And do I have my hero cape on, right? It's easy to have the hero cape on if I'm working my first work in this field was a 48 bed residential treatment program for substance use disorder. So I could be the hero all day long, right? These people are hurting. But when I sat in clinical meetings and I heard people referred to as broken, damaged, or as their diagnosis, I became profoundly curious about the true power of presence in helping a person get more in touch with their own inner wisdom, which is very different than a lot of the models.
I want to reflect a little about my relationship with this. I tend to think of shame and secrecy, which we were talking about, as I use like a moldy Tupperware metaphor, which is that when we leave food in the fridge for too long, it starts to mold, and then somehow we just like can't take it out, and then maybe when we want to take it out, we just want to throw it away instead of dishwashing it. But we actually can, no matter how much it's moldy, we could just deal with it at some point. But the longer it's there in the dark, festering, the more avoidant we become of it, the more impossible it seems to take it out, the more we just think we need to pack our bags and move to a new city. And I think shame works in the same way. If we don't bring it into the light, if we let it sit there and fester, we're not able to deal with it. And in my relationship, what I caught myself in was this like manic, angry, frantic battle trying to pull his Tupperware out of the fridge
Mm.
and him guarding the fridge. And I realized I was being ugly in the fight because no one wins in that battle. The shame does not come to light with peace and presence because I am unwilling to sit with you and just love you as you are. And the only way I can give you that presence is to leave. And so I truly hope someone else is giving that kind of loving presence. But what you're saying, this, that, the other, like, I had to leave because I couldn't do what you're talking about. When people are in this level of shame, they need to be seen with grace and love and pure acceptance, or nothing will come of it.
I am so grateful for this conversation. I just want to share with you, you are demonstrating, not talking about, but demonstrating what we're actually exploring, which is to be fully present with what wants to be revealed, what wants to emerge, not with an idea or a prescriptive, meaning like in this case, we don't have a script. We never have a script for this podcast, but in this particular case, I just think, Devin, you have demonstrated very beautifully what it means to simply be present and see what shows up because there is a transformation in the midst of that, and it's in honoring these different parts of self. And so as we're moving toward the last few minutes in our conversation, I'll ask you in a moment if you have any closing thoughts, but I just wanted to speak to that because for me, that's so much more powerful because we could have talked about this for 30 minutes easily, but you actually demonstrated it. And I know for myself, I feel it deeply. And I'm imagining and knowing that someone listening or someone watching right now will feel that. And that will provide a safety to open the Tupperware. Your analogy is amazing. I think, I might use that one as well because like swimming in oatmeal, yes, but yours is so much more palpable. And like, I know what it's like to avoid that Tupperware for months. Any closing thoughts you have? And of course, your full bio and contact information will be in the show notes, but anything you want to say in closing?
I think I'm drawn to the idea that it's not always empowering to do the thing we're ashamed of if we have to do it in secret, because that's where we entrench in the shame. But the more we can draw people into the light and the love and the presence around the shame and embracing our shadow side and letting them happen in areas of being loved and consented to and embraced, I think that's where real integrity happens, is when we don't hide them, but we find safe spaces for them.
Wow. Thank you for that. I feel so moved by this conversation, Devin. And so anyone watching, listening, I do know for sure that this is something that wants to be shared. So please subscribe and like. We, say that at the end of every podcast in the world now. But genuinely, what I want to share is if there's someone in your life, and it could be you, right? You might want to come back and listen to this again in 24 hours. But if there's someone in your life who you think will benefit from this, please share it with them. The intention of the Element Q podcast is to create these conversations that actually do help one transform. So thank you for everyone who's listening. Devin, thank you again so much for your willingness to be authentic and present in this conversation. I appreciate you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Element Q podcast. It's an honor to walk this path of healing and transformation with you. Remember, the courage and resilience of those who came before us live on in each of us. Let's continue to carry their legacy forward as we support one another in creating a world filled with love, gentleness, and empowerment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we're building a brighter future, one story at a time. Until next time, I'm TJ Woodward, and this has been the Element Q podcast.